A domestic worker noticed something strange going on in her employer's home. She decided to set up a camera, and what she discovered terrified her. Morning light filtered through the Villarreal mansion's large windows, illuminating the elegant furniture and shiny marble surfaces. Marcella, in her neat uniform, moved stealthily through the hallways, picking up used coffee cups and straightening crooked pictures. Her eyes, ever watchful and keen, took in every detail of the life going on around her. Doña Teresa, the Villarreal matriarch, slowly descended the stairs, gripping the banister with a trembling hand. Marcella rushed to help her, noting with concern that the old woman's face looked paler and more haggard than it had been last week. "Thank you, dear," Doña Teresa murmured with a weary smile. "I don't know what I would do without you." Before Marcella could answer, Javier, the eldest Villarreal son, appeared in the hall. His impeccable suit and charming smile contrasted with the coldness of his eyes. "Mom, what are you doing up so early? You should be resting," he said with a concern that Marcella found false. "I'm fine, son," Doña Teresa replied, although her voice trembled slightly. Marcella watched as Javier led his mother into the dining room, his hands firmly placed on the old woman's shoulders. There was something in his demeanor, a latent tension, that made a chill run down Marcella's spine. As she prepared breakfast, she heard snatches of conversation, words like inheritance, notary, and changes floating in the air, laden with a weight that Marcella could not ignore. As she poured the tea, she noticed Javier intently watching his mother drink, and a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile crossed his face. At that moment, Marcella sensed that something was deeply wrong in the Villarreal mansion. A seed of suspicion was planted in her mind, one that would grow to change the course of their lives forever. Days at the Villarreal mansion passed with a silent tension that Marcella could feel in the air. Each morning, she watched with growing concern as Doña Teresa seemed weaker, her steps more unsure, and her gaze more lost. One afternoon, as she was cleaning the library, she heard the voice of Laura, the youngest Villarreal daughter, echo down the hallway. "Mom, what happened to you?" The alarm in her voice caused Marcella to rush to the main hall, where she found Laura holding Doña Teresa, who seemed on the verge of fainting. Javier appeared immediately, his expression of concern seeming false. "It's nothing, just a dizziness," he said, taking his mother from Laura's arms with a force that seemed excessive to Marcella. "But she's getting worse," Laura insisted, her eyes filled with genuine concern. "We should take her to the doctor." "She already has a doctor," Javier replied brusquely. "I'll take care of everything." As she pretended to rearrange the cushions on the couch, Marcella noticed Javier's hands shaking slightly. As she helped her mother sit down, Marcella noticed a flash of nervousness or guilt in Javier's eyes. Laura said goodbye shortly after, promising to return soon. As soon as the door closed, the atmosphere changed drastically. Javier turned to Marcella, his gaze intense. "Make sure my mother takes all her medicines," he ordered. "I don't want any more unexpected visitors. She's very delicate." That night, as they served dinner, Marcella watched as Javier watched every bite her mother brought to her lips. The suspicion that had arisen days before grew, turning into a fear that constricted her chest. When Doña Teresa retired for the night, Marcella helped her change. "Little girl," the old woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm afraid. Something's not right." Marcella gently squeezed Doña Teresa's hand, her mind working frantically. She knew she had to do something. But what? The answer came as a whisper in the darkness. She needed proof. Marcella's heart was pounding as she placed the small camera on the vase in the main room. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was firm. The suspicions plaguing her needed confirmation, and this was the only way she could think of. "What are you doing?" Javier's voice startled her, nearly causing the vase to fall. "Just cleaning, sir," Marcella replied, praying her voice didn't betray her nervousness. Javier watched her with a piercing gaze that seemed to last an eternity. "Make sure you don't break anything. These vases are priceless," he finally said, before exiting the room. Marcella released the breath she didn't know she was holding. Adrenaline coursed through her veins, mixing with rising fear. What was she getting herself into? Arriving at her small apartment, she found Roberto waiting for her, a mix of worry and anger on his face. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice tense. "I've been waiting for hours." "Working, Roberto," Marcella replied, exhausted. "That long?" he insisted, jealousy coloring every word. Marcella wanted to tell him everything, to share the weight of her suspicions, but something stopped her. "It's just my job," she finally said. Roberto stared at her, doubt clear in his eyes. "Those rich people always take advantage, and you're always so willing to please them." His words stung, but Marcella was too tired to argue. As she prepared for sleep, her mind returned again and again to the hidden chamber in the mansion. What would it reveal? Was she exaggerating or about to discover something terrible? Sleep was slow in coming, and when it did, it was plagued by nightmares of Javier chasing her down endless dark hallways. She woke up startled, certain that, whatever happened, there was no turning back. She had crossed a line, and Doña Teresa's fate, and perhaps her own, depended on what she did next. The tension was palpable in the air of the Villarreal mansion, as Marcella moved stealthily through the hallways, her eyes always alert. With each movement, Marcella looked for the opportune moment to retrieve the hidden camera. The weight of what she could discover tormented her. Finally, taking advantage of a moment of distraction from the family, Marcella retrieved the device with trembling hands. She locked herself in the small cleaning room, her heart beating hard as she connected the camera to her phone. The images that appeared on the screen took her breath away. There was Javier, moving furtively in the darkness. She saw him approach the drinks cart, take a small bottle from his pocket and pour its contents into Doña Teresa's glass of water. Marcella stifled a scream, covering her mouth. Her worst suspicions were confirmed before her eyes. Javier, the favorite son, was slowly poisoning his own mother. The sound of approaching footsteps brought her out of her stupor. She quickly put everything away and left the room, trying to maintain normality. She passed Javier in the hallway, who looked at her with an intensity that chilled her blood. "Marcella," he said in a deceptively soft voice. "Everything in order?" "Yes, sir," she replied, struggling to maintain her composure. "I was just organizing the cleaning products." Javier nodded slowly, without taking his eyes off her. "Remember that discretion is essential in this house," he warned her, with words that, although they seemed harmless, sounded like a veiled threat in Marcella's ears. She nodded mechanically and walked away, feeling his gaze fixed on her back. That night, in the solitude of her apartment, Marcella relived the images she had seen over and over again. The horror of the situation overwhelmed her. What should she do? Confront Javier? Alert the police? Tell Doña Teresa? Each option seemed more dangerous than the last. Marcella felt trapped in a web of secrets and lies, with Doña Teresa's life hanging in the balance. The responsibility of that knowledge weighed on her like a stone, robbing her of sleep and peace. As the night progressed, Marcella made a decision. She could not sit idly by. She had to act, even if it meant risking everything. The arrival of Carlos, the youngest son of the Villarreals, fell like a bomb on the tense atmosphere of the mansion. Marcella watched him enter with his disheveled appearance and bloodshot eyes, evidence that his addiction continued to control his life. "Carlos!" exclaimed Doña Teresa, with a mixture of joy and concern. "We didn't know you would come." Javier appeared in the hall with a barely concealed expression of disgust. "What a surprise, little brother. To what do we owe the honor?" Carlos ignored the sarcasm. "Do I need reasons to visit my own mother?" he replied, hugging Doña Teresa tightly. Marcella, while pretending to put some books away, noticed how the old woman was staggering slightly under the embrace. Her deteriorating health was becoming more and more evident. During dinner, the tension was palpable. Carlos devoured the food greedily, while Javier watched him with barely contained contempt. As he helped Doña Teresa up the stairs, Carlos noticed for the first time his mother's deteriorating condition. "Mum, are you okay?" he asked, worried. Before Doña Teresa could respond, Javier intervened coldly. "She's fine. She's just tired. Marcela, accompany my mother to her room." As she climbed the stairs, Marcela heard the argument that broke out in the dining room. "What's wrong with Mom?" Carlos's voice was worried and accusatory. "Nothing that matters to you," Javier replied disdainfully. "How much do you need this time? Tell me and leave." A fist hit the table hard, echoing throughout the house. "I didn't come for money," Carlos shouted. Marcela closed the door to Doña Teresa's room, isolating her from the noise. The old woman looked at her sadly. "My children," she whispered. "Where did I fail with them?" That night, while the mansion slept, Marcela was in a whirlwind of emotions. Carlos's arrival further complicated the situation. He could be an ally, or his presence could make things worse. With each passing hour, Marcela felt like time was running out for Doña Teresa, and that she was the only one who could help her. Her heart was racing as she frantically reviewed the recordings on her phone screen. The images confirmed her worst fears. Javier systematically pouring a suspicious liquid into his mother's drinks. Absorbed in the images, she didn't hear the approaching footsteps. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over her. "What do you think you're doing?" Javier's voice, cold as ice, paralyzed her. Marcela turned slowly, terror in her eyes. Javier was there, his expression one of suppressed fury. I was just... Marcela stammered, but her words were choked off as Javier snatched the phone from her. Her eyes narrowed at the images on the screen. "So you think you're a detective?" he said, a palpable threat in his voice. In an instant, Javier grabbed her arm with brutal force. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he growled, dragging her down the hallway. Marcela tried to break free, but Javier's grip was like iron. "Let me go," she screamed, panic taking hold of her. Javier pushed her into an empty room and closed the door behind them. "Did you think you could meddle in my business and get away with it?" His voice was dangerously low. "Please, sir," Marcela pleaded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I won't say anything, I swear." A cruel smile spread across Javier's face. "Oh, of course you won't say anything," he replied, "because you won't go anywhere." With horror, Marcela grasped the terrible reality of her situation. She was trapped at the mercy of a man capable of poisoning his own mother. "From now on," Javier continued, threat clear in his voice, "you will live here and continue with your duties as if nothing had happened. One misstep, one misplaced word, and it won't be just you who will suffer the consequences." Marcela felt her world crumble around her. From being Doña Teresa's potential savior to becoming a prisoner in the very house she was trying to protect, Marcela collapsed to the floor as Javier left the room, locking the door behind her. The weight of her new reality crushed her, leaving her wondering how she could save Doña Teresa and, at the same time, how she could save herself. The sun was setting over the city, turning the sky red as Roberto paced back and forth in the small apartment he shared with Marcela. His face reflected the anguish that grew with every minute without news from her. He dialed her number for the umpteenth time, only to hear the ringtone go unanswered. "Come on, Marcela, answer," he muttered, frustration and fear laced in his voice. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Roberto grabbed his keys and left the apartment. Night was falling over the city as he drove toward the Villarreal mansion, his mind a whirlwind of increasingly far-fetched thoughts and theories. Upon arrival, he stopped in front of the imposing entrance gate. The mansion's lights shone in the darkness, but there was something unsettling about its apparent tranquility. Roberto rang the doorbell, his heart pounding in his chest. After what seemed like an eternity, Javier's voice came through the intercom. "Yes, who is it?" "I'm Roberto, Marcela's boyfriend," he replied, trying to remain calm. "I need to talk to her." There was a long silence before Javier answered. "Marcela is busy right now. She can't help you." Anger and worry mixed in Roberto's chest. "Please, I just want to know if she's okay. I haven't heard from her in days." "I assure you she's perfectly fine." Javier said coldly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, we have important matters to attend to." The connection was cut off, leaving Roberto alone in the darkness, with more questions than answers. He stared up at the windows of the mansion, wondering what secrets those walls held. As he returned to his car, a fierce determination took hold of him. He wouldn't give up so easily. He would find a way to get to Marcela, no matter what it took. Sitting in his car, Roberto began to plan his next move, mixing concern for Marcela with a growing suspicion of the Villarreals. What was really going on in that mansion? And most importantly, how could she rescue Marcela from the clutches of that family? Laura Villarreal crossed the threshold of the family mansion with a feeling of unease she couldn't shake. The atmosphere, once warm and welcoming, was now charged with a palpable tension that made her skin crawl. "Mom," she called, her voice echoing in the quiet hallway. Javier appeared, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Laura, what a surprise. We weren't expecting you." "I came to see Mom," Laura replied, scanning her brother's face. "How is he?" "Resting," Javier answered quickly. "You know how he is. He has good days and bad days." Noticing something strange in her brother's behavior, Laura wanted to see her mother as soon as possible. As they climbed the stairs, Laura saw Marcela cleaning a vase, and something in the maid's gaze unnerved her. She seemed scared, almost pleading. Entering Doña Teresa's room, Laura stifled a scream. Her mother lay in bed, paler and more haggard than she remembered. "Mom," she whispered, approaching quickly. "What's going on?" Doña Teresa slowly opened her eyes and murmured in a weak voice, "Laura, my girl, how nice to see you." Laura turned to Javier, her concern turning to anger. "Why didn't you tell me she was like this? She needs a doctor." "Javier has the best care," he replied in a sharp tone. "We don't need you to come and upset her." While they argued, Marcela quietly entered with a tray of tea. Laura watched as the maid looked anxiously at Javier before pouring the cups. "Marcela," Laura said softly, "is everything okay?" Before Marcela could respond, Javier intervened. "Marcela has a lot of work. Leave her alone." Laura watched as Marcela hurried out, her head down. Something didn't fit in the whole situation. She spent the rest of the afternoon with her mother, noticing every tremor and wince. When she finally prepared to leave, she was determined to find out the truth. "I'll be back soon," she promised her mother, kissing her forehead. As she left, she passed Marcela in the hallway and, on impulse, whispered, "If you need help, let me know." The look of terror in Marcela's eyes confirmed her suspicions. Something sinister was going on at the Villarreal mansion, and Laura was determined to find out no matter the cost. Night had fallen over the Villarreal mansion when Carlos, with unsteady steps, made his way to the kitchen in search of something to calm his anxiety. The deathly silence was only interrupted by the echo of his own footsteps. As he entered the kitchen, he stopped short when he saw Marcela there, her back to him, sobbing silently as she held a phone in her shaking hands. "What the hell?" Carlos muttered, startled. Marcela turned around, panic visible in her reddened eyes. "Mr. Carlos, I'm not—" "It's nothing," she stammered, trying to hide the phone. Though dazed from the effects of his addiction, Carlos noticed something odd about her behavior and stepped closer, snatching the phone from her hands. "What is this?" he asked, frowning at the images on the screen. His expression went from confusion to horror as he recognized his brother Javier pouring something into their mother's drink. "Oh my God," he whispered, the reality of the situation hitting him hard. "Javier is poisoning Mom." Seeing that there was no point in hiding the truth anymore, Marcela nodded, tears in her eyes. "Your brother found out. He's got me prisoner here. I don't know what to do," she confessed between sobs. Carlos ran a hand over his face, his mind struggling to process the information. For a moment, the fog of his addiction lifted, replaced by a terrifying clarity. We have to do something, he said determinedly. Carlos said more to himself than to Marcela, but then a terrifying, selfish thought, born of years of resentment and addiction, crossed his mind. Or maybe, he muttered with a crooked smile, I could profit from this, Marcela. Horrified by the change in his expression, Marcela asked, dreading the answer. What do you mean? Carlos stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. This is very valuable. You know Javier would pay a fortune to keep it a secret. But Marcela weakly replied, My mother was never there for me. Bitterness was evident in Carlos's voice. Why should I care now? Marcela stepped back, realizing she had made a grave mistake in trusting Carlos. Now she had to fear not only Javier, but also her youngest son, consumed by his addiction and resentment. As Carlos walked out of the kitchen with Marcela's phone in his possession, she realized she was more alone than ever. The hope of saving Doña Teresa seemed to fade with every second. It was barely dawn when, with her heart racing, Marcela took advantage of Javier's carelessness, who had left early, to sneak towards the front door. Her fingers were brushing the doorknob when a voice froze her. Where do you think you're going? Carlos's rough voice, mixed with sleep and something else, made her turn slowly. I was just going to take out the trash, Marcela lied, her voice barely a whisper. Carlos, with bloodshot eyes, approached, scrutinizing her. Don't take me for an idiot, he growled. I know what you're trying to do. In a desperate act, Marcela pushed Carlos with all her strength and ran down the hallway. The sound of her footsteps and Carlos's screams echoed in the silent mansion. Stop her! Carlos roared, stumbling in pursuit. Marcela ran up the stairs, her mind a whirlwind of panic, and as she turned a corner, she found herself face to face with Doña Teresa, who had emerged from her room alarmed by the commotion. What's going on? The old woman asked, her voice weak but concerned. Doña Teresa, you have to listen to me, Marcela gasped, her words tripping over each other. Your son, Javier. But before she could finish, Carlos caught up with her, grabbing her arm tightly. Don't pay attention to him, Mum, he said in a forcefully calm voice. Marcela doesn't feel well. Doña Teresa looked from one to the other, confusion and fear evident on her haggard face. I don't understand, she muttered. At that moment, the front door burst open and Javier entered, surveying the scene with a grim look as he saw Marcela standing next to her mother. What the hell is going on here? He roared, taking the stairs 3 at a time. Marcela, trapped between the two brothers, looked desperately at Doña Teresa. Please, she pleaded, you have to believe me, they are... But her words were muffled when Javier grabbed her, covering her mouth with his hand. Mom, go back to your room, Carlos ordered. Take her. While Carlos led a confused and fearful Doña Teresa back to her room, Javier dragged Marcela into an empty living room. He shoved her forcefully inside and closed the door behind them. Game over, he hissed, his eyes blazing with fury. You've exhausted my patience. Marcela, cornered and terrified, realized that her escape attempt had failed miserably. Now she faced the consequences of her desperate act of bravery, not knowing if she would survive to try again. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of the Villarreal mansion as Roberto, with steely determination in his gaze, approached the front door. After days of planning, watching from afar and waiting for the right moment, he rang the doorbell. The seconds seemed like an eternity until the door opened, revealing Javier's impassive face. You again? Javier growled, irritated. I told you Marcela is busy. Roberto, summoning all his courage, stepped forward. I need to see her now. Something in his tone made Javier hesitate for a moment. Finally, with an exasperated sigh, she let him in. Wait here, he ordered, pointing to the hallway. Roberto watched anxiously as Javier climbed the stairs. Minutes later, Marcela appeared, her face pale and dark-circled. Roberto, she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. He moved closer, noticing the trembling in her hands and the tension in her posture. Marcela, what's going on? Why haven't you answered my calls? Before she could respond, Javier intervened, his voice soft but menacing. Come on, Marcela. Tell your boyfriend everything is okay. Marcela looked at Javier and then at Roberto, fear evident in her eyes. I'm fine, she muttered lamely. Roberto frowned, his concern turning to suspicion. I don't believe you. Something is wrong here. Javier stepped between them, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Look, Roberto, I understand your concern, but I assure you that she is fine. She has been very busy taking care of my sick mother. Then let me talk to her alone, Roberto insisted. Impossible, Javier replied, his tone cold. My mother needs constant attention. Roberto looked at Marcela, searching for some sign, some clue as to what was really going on. She avoided his gaze, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Marcela, he said softly, if something is wrong, if you need help, just tell me. For a moment, it looked like Marcela was going to speak and reveal everything, but Javier put a hand on her shoulder, squeezing lightly. I think it's time for you to go, Roberto, he said, his voice laced with thinly veiled menace. Roberto, feeling helpless and frustrated, took a step back. This isn't over, he warned, looking directly at Javier. I'll be back. As the door closed behind him, Roberto swore he would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The image of Marcela, frightened and seemingly imprisoned, was etched into her mind. Laura Villarreal silently crept through the halls of the family mansion, her heart pounding in her chest. The uneasiness that had plagued her for days had driven her to this nightly foray, determined to uncover the truth about her mother's deteriorating condition. With cautious steps, she entered Javier's study. The moonlight, filtering through the windows, cast sinister shadows on the luxurious furnishings. Laura turned on the flashlight on her phone, dimly illuminating the room, and began rummaging through the desk drawers. Her hands trembled slightly as she sifted through documents and folders. Suddenly, her fingers touched something cold and metallic. She pulled out a small vial, its label barely legible in the dim light. "What is this?" she muttered to herself, bringing the vial closer to the light. The sound of footsteps in the hallway startled her. She quickly put the vial in her pocket and turned off the flashlight. The door slowly opened and Laura held her breath. "Miss Laura!" Marcela's voice, barely a whisper, broke the silence. Laura emerged from her hiding place, relief and tension evident on her face. "Marcela, what are you doing up at this hour?" The employee glanced nervously down the hallway before closing the door behind her. "I need to talk to you," she said urgently, about her mother and brother Javier. Laura felt her heart race. "What's wrong with them?" Marcela, tears in her eyes, began to recount everything she had seen and discovered. Laura's suspicions were confirmed with each word, horror growing within her. "My God," Laura whispered, pulling the vial from her pocket. "So this is poison," she confirmed, looking at Marcela, whose voice broke as she said, "I've seen him use it." Suddenly, the sound of a key turning in the lock paralyzed them. The door swung open, revealing Javier, his face contorted in fury. My, he said in a dangerously soft voice. "What an interesting meeting we have here." Laura stepped in front of Marcela, facing her brother. "It's over, Javier," she declared, raising the flask. "We know everything." Javier closed the door behind him, his eyes flashing with a mix of rage and calculation. "You have no idea what you're talking about, sis," he growled, advancing on them. Laura and Marcela stepped back, trapped between the desk and Javier. The air was charged with tension as the two women realized they were facing not only danger, but the very real threat Javier posed. The tension in the room was palpable, the air heavy with fear and anticipation. Javier, with a frightening calm, closed the door to the study. "You are always too curious for your own good, Laura," Javier said, his voice a menacing whisper. "And you, Marcela, should have learned to keep your mouth shut." Laura frantically clenched the jar in her hands. "Why, Javier, how could you do this to Mom?" Javier let out a bitter laugh. "You don't understand. This family, this empire, needs a strong leader. Mum has become weak, incapable of making decisions. I'm doing what's necessary, slowly killing her, he exclaimed. Horrified, Laura looked at Marcela, who gathered all her courage to intervene. Doña Teresa trusts you, loves you. How can you betray her like this? Javier's eyes darkened, and with a swift movement he grabbed Marcela by the arm, dragging her towards him. You have no right to speak of betrayal, he growled. Laura saw the opportunity and ran for the door, but Javier was faster. He pushed Marcela aside and blocked the exit. You're not going anywhere, he declared in an ice-cold voice. At that moment, a weak scream echoed from the hallway. Laura, what's going on? It was Doña Teresa's voice. The three of them froze, panic visible in Javier's eyes. Taking advantage of the distraction, Laura pushed past her brother and flung open the door. Mom, we're here, she shouted. Doña Teresa appeared in the hallway, her fragile figure leaning against the doorframe, her eyes filled with surprise and confusion. Javier, desperate, lunged at his mother. Mom, go back to your room. You're not feeling well. But Laura was faster. No, Mom, Javier's been poisoning you. Doña Teresa's face paled, her gaze alternating between Laura and Javier, disbelief giving way to horror. No, it can't be, she muttered. Seeing everything falling apart, Javier tried one last desperate move and lunged at his mother, but Marcela, in an act of bravery, stood in his way. In the confusion, the bottle fell to the floor, breaking into 1,000 pieces. The liquid spilled, its acrid smell filling the air, undeniable proof of Javier's betrayal. Doña Teresa, finally understanding the terrible truth, collapsed. Laura ran to support her while Marcela struggled to restrain Javier. The scene was a chaos of screams, tears, and accusations. The truth, carefully hidden, finally came to light, leaving the Villarreal family on the edge of the abyss. The chaos that followed the revelation was deafening. Screams and accusations filled the air, while Doña Teresa, pale and shaking, was held by Laura. Javier, cornered, looked frantically around for a way out. In the midst of the commotion, Carlos appeared in the hallway, his eyes wide with confusion and the effect of the drugs. What the hell is going on here? He shouted hoarsely, cutting through the commotion. Laura, still holding her mother, looked at Carlos with a mixture of urgency and hope. Carlos, help us! Javier has been poisoning Mom! For a moment, Carlos seemed to freeze, his mind struggling to process the information. His eyes moved from his mother's horrified face to Javier's, which showed a mixture of fury and fear. Javier, seeing an opportunity, turned to his brother. Carlos, don't believe them. But something in Doña Teresa's gaze and the trembling in her body made Carlos doubt himself for the first time in years. The fog of his addiction seemed to dissipate, replaced by a painful clarity. It's true, isn't it? He murmured, more to himself than to the others. All this time, Marcela, noticing the conflict in Carlos's eyes, stepped forward. Mr. Carlos, you knew it. You saw the evidence. Please, help us save your mother. These words seemed to break something inside Carlos. With a cry of rage and pain, he launched himself at Javier, knocking him to the ground. Damn bastard, he roared, blindly striking out with his fists. Laura took advantage of the moment to pull Doña Teresa away from the chaos with Marcela's help. Call the police, she whispered to the employee, who nodded and ran to the phone. As the siblings struggled on the floor, Doña Teresa, in a weak but determined voice, spoke. Enough, please, my children. What have we become? His words, laden with pain and disappointment, seemed to freeze time. Carlos stopped, his fists still in the air, as Javier lay motionless, the reality of his actions reflected in his eyes. In that moment of stillness, the sound of sirens in the distance broke the silence. Help was on the way, but the damage to the Villarreal family had already been done. Marcela, returning to the group, looked at the scene with a mixture of relief and sadness. The truth had come to light, but the cost had been high. As the police approached, everyone realized that nothing would ever be the same at the Villarreal mansion. The echo of the sirens faded into the distance, leaving a heavy silence over the mansion. Javier had been taken away by the police, leaving behind a trail of emotional destruction. Doña Teresa, exhausted by the events, rested in her room under the care of an emergency doctor. Marcela, her heart racing from the adrenaline of recent events, was in the hospital. She was in the kitchen, shaking as she made tea. The sound of footsteps startled her, making her turn sharply. Roberto stood in the doorway, his face showing relief and concern. "Marcela," he whispered, approaching slowly. Roberto responded to her tears uncontrollably. "I saw the patrols," he explained, closing the distance between them. "I had to come. Are you okay? What happened?" Marcela opened her mouth to respond, but the words were choked off by a sob. Roberto wrapped his arms around her, holding her as she finally allowed herself to release all the pent-up tension and fear. Through her tears, Marcela told him everything: the poisoning, her captivity, Laura's discovery. Roberto listened, his expression darkening with each revelation. "I should have done more," he murmured, guilt evident in his voice. "I knew something was wrong." Marcela pulled back slightly, looking into his eyes. "You couldn't possibly know. I could hardly believe it myself." The moment was interrupted by Carlos, who staggered into the kitchen, his eyes bloodshot. Her face marked with guilt and regret. Marcela, in a raspy voice, said, "I'm sorry. I should have helped you sooner." Roberto tensed, putting himself in a protective stance in front of Marcela. "Who are you?" he asked, his distrust evident. "Carlos, the younger brother," Marcela explained softly, placing a hand on Roberto's arm to calm him. Carlos looked at them, shame clear on his face. "I'm part of this," he admitted. "I knew what Javier was doing and I didn't do anything. I tried to take advantage of the situation." Roberto advanced menacingly towards Carlos, but Marcela stopped him. "No, Roberto, there's been enough violence." The silence that followed was interrupted by Roberto's phone. He stared at the screen, frowning. "It's my boss," he said. "I have to take it." While Roberto walked off to answer the call, Marcela was left alone with Carlos, the air heavy with tension and unspoken words. The night had been long and revealing, but Marcela sensed there were still secrets to be revealed and wounds to be healed in the Villarreal mansion. By dawn, the Villarreal mansion was deceptively calm. Laura, dark under her eyes from a sleepless night, was in her father's study, going through papers and folders with feverish determination. "He has to be here," she muttered to herself, flipping through pages of financial documents. Marcela entered silently, carrying a tray of coffee. "Miss Laura," she said softly, "you should get some rest." Laura looked up, her eyes red but filled with fierce determination. "I can't, Marcela. I have to find the evidence. Javier didn't act alone, I'm sure." At that moment, Carlos appeared in the doorway, his disheveled appearance contrasting with the elegance of the studio. "What are you looking for?" he asked, his voice still hoarse from sleep and hangover. Laura looked at him with frustration and hope. "The records of Dad's offshore accounts. Javier mentioned something about them last night." Her voice cracked. Unable to finish the sentence, Carlos moved closer, a spark of recognition in his eyes. "Wait, I think I know where they might be." Under the watchful eyes of Laura and Marcela, Carlos made his way to an old painting on the wall, moving it, revealing a hidden safe. "The combination," he muttered, his fingers shaking as he turned the dial. "It's Mom's birthday." The box clicked open, revealing a stack of documents. Laura lunged at them, her eyes frantically scanning the pages. "Here it is!" she exclaimed, with a mixture of triumph and horror. $1 million transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands. And look at the signatures. Javier and Dad. Carlos slumped into a chair, the weight of the revelation crushing him. So it wasn't just Javier. Dad was involved too. Marcela watched the scene, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. "But what does this mean for Mrs. Teresa?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Laura straightened up, her expression determined. "It means this is much bigger than we imagined or thought." Not only do we have to protect Mom from Javier, but also from a corrupt system that has operated under our noses for years. The sound of footsteps in the hallway alerted them. Roberto appeared in the doorway with a serious expression. "Marcela, we need to talk," he said, casting a distrustful glance toward the Villarreal brothers. Laura, sensing the tension, quickly intervened. "Roberto, I know you have reason to be distrustful, but we need your help. This is bigger than all of us." As Roberto hesitated on the threshold, Marcela sensed that they were on the edge of an abyss. The revelations of that morning had changed everything, and now they faced not only Javier's betrayal, but a conspiracy that threatened to destroy the foundations of the Villarreal family. The atmosphere in the Villarreal mansion was tense, charged with newly discovered secrets and broken trusts. Marcela moved silently through the halls, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and escape plans. She knew that, despite the revelations, her position remained precarious. As she approached Doña Teresa's room, she heard muffled voices. She stopped, her heart pounding. "Mom, you have to understand," Laura said in a pleading voice. "It is not safe for you to stay here." "This is my house," Doña Teresa replied, her voice weak but determined. "I will not run away like a criminal." Marcela moved closer, holding her breath. "Ma'am," Doña Teresa's voice interjected. "Roberto," surprising Marcela, "I understand your position, but the situation is serious. Javier could be released at any moment." There was a moment of silence, and then Doña Teresa spoke again, her voice breaking with emotion. "How did we get to this? My own family." Marcela could not contain herself any longer and entered the room, surprising everyone. "Doña Teresa," she said firmly, "I know it's not my place, but I must insist. We need to get her out of here." Everyone looked at her, and Laura nodded gratefully, while Roberto looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. Doña Teresa, with tears in her eyes, looked at Marcela. "Marcela, you have been more of a family to me than my own children. If you think I should go—" At that moment, Carlos burst into the room, pale. "I just received a call. Javier has been released on bail. He's coming this way." Panic gripped the room. Laura hurriedly began gathering her mother's belongings, while Roberto headed to the window to keep watch. Marcela, acting on instinct, took Doña Teresa's hand. "Come on, ma'am. I know an exit through the kitchen that no one else knows about." With a strength that surprised everyone, she helped Doña Teresa to her feet. The old woman, leaning on Marcela, nodded determinedly. "Lead the way, my dear." As the group hurried through the halls of the mansion following Marcela, the sound of an approaching car alerted them. Roberto, bringing up the rear, cursed under his breath. "We have to hurry!" Marcela led the group toward the exit. She entered the kitchen, her heart pounding as she opened a hidden door behind the pantry. She couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. She, a simple servant, was now leading the escape of the family she had served for years. As the group began to leave through the secret exit, the sound of the front door slamming open echoed in the air, followed by Javier's furious voice calling for his mother. Panic drove everyone to hurry. Marcela closed the door behind them, plunging them into the darkness of the secret passage. As she led Doña Teresa and the others to freedom, Marcela knew that nothing would be the same. Night had already fallen over the city by the time the group emerged from the secret passage, finding themselves in a narrow alley behind the Villarreal mansion. The cool air hit their faces, bringing a mix of relief and anxiety. Marcela, still holding Doña Teresa tightly, looked around cautiously. "We have to move quickly," she whispered. "I know a place where we can temporarily hide." Roberto nodded, taking the lead. "My car is a few blocks from here. If we can get there, we can get away without being seen." They began to move stealthily down the alley, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the tension of the moment. Laura and Carlos flanked their mother, while Marcela and Roberto brought up the rear. Suddenly, the roar of an engine startled them. Headlights illuminated the entrance to the alley, and Javier's furious voice echoed through the night. "I know you're there. You can't hide from me." Panic gripped the group. Roberto, acting quickly, led them to a dumpster. "Hide," he ordered. Marcella, however, made a split-second decision. "I'll distract him," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "You guys get Mrs. Teresa to safety before anyone can stop her." Marcella took off running toward the main street, away from the group's hiding spot. Javier, seeing her, accelerated his vehicle in their direction. Marcella ran with all her might, her heart pounding, aware that every second she gained was crucial to the safety of Mrs. Teresa and the others. The streets became a maze as Marcella zigzagged between alleys and avenues, the roar of Javier's engine always close by. Fear drove her, but so did determination to protect those who had trusted her. In an unexpected turn, Marcella found herself at a dead end. The sound of Javier's car approaching made her blood run cold. She spun around, facing the headlights that cornered her, preparing for the worst. Javier stepped out of the car, his face distorted with anger. "Game over!" he roared. Marcella, cornered but not defeated, raised her chin defiantly. "It was never a game, Javier, and I will never let you hurt your mother or anyone else." As Javier moved forward, Marcella silently prayed that her sacrifice had been worth it. It had given the others enough time to escape. The night was far from over, and the danger was just beginning. The dead end had become a death trap for Marcella. Javier, his eyes bloodshot with anger and frustration, slowly approached, like a predator cornering its prey. "You were always a nuisance, Marcella," Javier said, his voice laced with venom, "but I never imagined you'd be capable of so much." Marcella, her back against the wall, frantically searched for a way out. Her mind was racing, aware that every second gained was vital to the escape of Doña Teresa and the others. "What I did was the right thing," she replied, trying not to let her voice betray the fear she felt. "Someone had to protect your mother from you." Javier let out a bitter laugh. "Protect her? You have no idea. Everything I've done has been for the good of the family." At that moment, a noise at the entrance to the alley caught both their attention. Carlos appeared, staggering slightly, his eyes alternating between his brother and Marcella. "Javier, what the hell are you doing here?" Carlos growled, moving forward to stand between Javier and Marcella. "It's over, brother," he said in a surprisingly firm voice. "I can't continue being complicit in this." Javier looked at his brother with a mix of disbelief and contempt. "You, the useless drug addict, are going to stop me." "I may be an addict," Carlos replied, "but at least I'm not a monster trying to kill his own mother." The tension in the air was palpable. Marcella, seeing an opportunity, began to slowly move to the side, looking for an escape route. Javier, noticing the movement, lunged at her. Carlos, in an act of unexpected bravery, lunged at his brother, tackling him to the ground. "Run, Marcella!" Carlos shouted as he struggled with Javier. Marcella didn't need to be told twice and ran for the alley exit, the sound of the fight fading behind her. The streets became a blur as she ran, her heart pounding, adrenaline driving her. Finally, exhausted and panting, she reached a main avenue. She leaned against a light pole, trying to catch her breath and get her bearings. Suddenly, a car pulled up. The car suddenly slammed in front of her. The window rolled down, revealing Roberto's worried face. "Marcella, thank God we found you," he exclaimed, opening the passenger door. Marcella quickly climbed in, noticing with relief that Donna Teresa and Laura were in the back seat, safe. "Carlos!" Marcella gasped as Roberto pulled away, staying behind facing Javier. Laura stifled a scream while Donna Teresa closed her eyes in pain. "We have to go back for him," Marcella insisted. Roberto nodded gravely and turned the car in a risky maneuver as they headed back to the alley. Marcella silently prayed, hoping that Carlos's act of redemption had not come too late. Roberto's car glided through the dark streets, the tension palpable. Inside the alley, Marcella, heart in her mouth, scanned the shadows for any sign of Carlos or Javier. Suddenly, a piercing scream broke the night's silence. "There!" Marcella exclaimed, pointing towards a nearby alley. Roberto slammed on the brakes, tires screeching against the asphalt before the car came to a complete stop. Marcella had already taken off running towards the source of the sound. The scene she found paralyzed her. Carlos lay on the ground, wounded and terrified, while Javier, knife in hand, loomed over him, his face twisted in a grimace of fury and madness. "Stop!" Marcela screamed, her voice echoing off the walls of the alley. Javier spun around, his eyes shining with a mix of surprise and rage. "I should have taken you out when I had the chance," he hissed, advancing towards her. Marcela backed away, frantically searching for something to defend herself. Her fingers brushed against an abandoned metal bar on the ground. She grabbed it and held it in front of her like a shield. "It's over," Javier said, trying to keep his voice steady, but the fear palpable. "The police are on their way." Javier let out a maniacal laugh. "Do you think I care? I have nothing left to lose." He lunged at Marcela with the knife raised. She missed the attack by inches, feeling the blade graze her arm. With a cry of pain and adrenaline, Marcela swung the metal bar, hitting Javier in the arm. The knife fell to the ground with a metallic clink. Javier, roaring with rage, lunged at Marcela, both of them rolling on the ground, struggling desperately. In that instant, the sound of sirens filled the air and police lights illuminated the entrance to the alley. Javier, distracted for a second, loosened his grip. Marcela, gathering her last strength, managed to push him away and free herself. She crawled towards Carlos, who was breathing heavily. "Resist," she whispered, pressing his wound with shaking hands. The policemen burst into the alley, their guns pointed at Javier. "On the ground now!" they shouted. Javier, cornered and out of options, slowly raised his hands, his face, once filled with fury, now showing a mix of defeat and resignation. As the officers handcuffed Javier, Marcela hugged Carlos, tears of relief and fear running down her cheeks. Roberto appeared at her side, closely followed by Laura and a trembling Doña Teresa. "My son," Doña Teresa sobbed, kneeling beside Carlos. Marcela, exhausted and in pain, looked around. The nightmare seemed to be over, but the cost had been high. As the ambulance sirens drew closer, Marcela realized that although they had survived that hellish night, the road to healing and justice was just beginning. San Rafael Hospital was bustling in the early hours of the morning. In the waiting room, Marcela, Laura, and Roberto waited for news, their faces marked by exhaustion and worry. Carlos was fighting for his life in the operating room. Suddenly, the doors swung open and a group of police officers entered, led by a stern-looking woman who introduced herself as Detective Ramirez. "I need to speak to all of you," she announced in a firm but understanding voice. "We have new information on the Villarreal case." Laura, who had been standing with a defensive posture, started. "What's wrong?" she asked. "It's about Javier," the detective replied, nodding gravely. "We've discovered that the conspiracy is broader than we thought. Javier wasn't acting alone." Marcela felt the ground shake beneath her feet. "What do you mean?" she asked, dreading the answer. "We've found evidence of a corruption network involving top executives of Villarreal companies and government officials," Ramirez explained. "The poisoning of Mrs. Teresa was just the tip of the iceberg." Laura slumped in her seat, shock evident on her face. "It can't be. Who else is involved?" The detective pulled out a folder. "We have a list of suspects, including several close associates of your father. We will need your cooperation to unravel all this." Roberto, who had remained silent, intervened. "What will happen to Mrs. Teresa and Carlos? Are they safe?" "We have assigned guards to their rooms here," Ramirez assured. "But given the magnitude of the conspiracy, we would recommend moving them to a safe place once they are stable." Marcela, feeling the weight of responsibility, stepped forward. "I can help. I know all the secrets of the Villarreal family." The detective looked at her with interest. "Your testimony will be crucial, miss, but you must understand that by getting involved, you will also be in danger." At that moment, a doctor approached the group. "Family members of Carlos Villarreal," he called. Laura jumped up. "I am his sister. How is he?" The doctor gave a small smile. "The surgery was a success. He is stable, but he will need time to recover." A sigh of relief swept through the group, though the feeling of relief was short-lived as the reality of the situation set in once again. Marcela looked at Detective Ramirez, then at Laura and Roberto. The full truth was about to be revealed, and with it, even greater dangers would come. But now, more than ever, she was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. "I'm ready to testify," Marcela said firmly. "It's time for the full truth to come out." Detective Ramirez's office was austere, lit only by the dim light of a desk lamp. Marcela sat across from the detective, her hands clasped in her lap. Laura and Roberto waited outside, their tense faces visible through the glass door. "Fine," Ramirez said, turning on a tape recorder. "Tell me everything from the beginning." Marcela took a deep breath and began her story, telling of her first suspicions, of the half-heard conversations she had overheard, and of the subtle changes in Javier's behavior. Marcela trembled as she recalled the moment she discovered the truth about the poisoning. It was as if the world had collapsed. Her eyes were filled with unshed tears as she described the lie behind the family she had served for years. The detective listened intently, taking occasional notes. "And when did you decide to act?" Ramirez asked. Marcela closed her eyes for a moment, reliving those moments of terror and decision. "When I realized that Doña Teresa's life was in real danger, I knew I couldn't just sit back." As Marcela recounted recent events, the magnitude of the conspiracy became increasingly clear. Names of businessmen, politicians, and even judges began to appear, weaving an endless web of corruption. "This is bigger than we imagined," Ramirez murmured, frowning in concentration. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted the statement. An officer rushed in, his face pale. "Detective, we have a problem. Javier Villarreal has escaped police custody." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcela felt the air drain out of her. "This can't be," she whispered. Ramirez stood up immediately. "I need Marcela and the Villarreal family placed under immediate protection. This just got a lot more dangerous." As the office erupted into activity, Marcela sat still, her mind in a whirl of fear and determination. "Detective," she said in a surprisingly firm voice, "I need to finish my statement. If Javier is free, then more than ever the whole truth must come out." Ramirez looked at her with a mix of admiration and concern. "You're brave, Marcela, but you're Javier's main target now." Marcela nodded, aware of the danger, but determined. "I know, but I can't live in fear. It's time to face this, no matter what." As the detective gave orders to tighten security, Marcela prepared to continue her testimony. The truth was about to be revealed in full, and with it would come even greater danger. But Marcela was ready to face it, for Doña Teresa, for justice, and for herself. The atmosphere in the police headquarters conference room was tense. Marcela, flanked by Laura and Roberto, faced a panel of investigators and prosecutors. Detective Ramirez presided over the meeting, her face a mask of determination. "Gentlemen," Ramirez began, "we are here to hear the full testimony of Marcela Gutierrez, a key witness in the Villarreal case." Marcela took a deep breath, aware that each word she spoke could change the course of many lives. She began her story, her voice initially shaky, but gaining strength with each revelation. "It all began 6 months ago," she said. "I noticed subtle changes in Javier's behavior toward his mother, little details that I initially dismissed. As Marcela unraveled the complex web of lies and corruption, the faces of those present darkened as they heard the names of prominent businessmen, politicians, and even judges, each connected in some way to the Villarreal empire. Javier's plan was about much more than just inheriting the family fortune, Marcela explained. He was orchestrating a takeover of several state-owned companies, using his mother's influence as a cover. Horrified, Laura interjected, "How could he hide it for so long? He had accomplices everywhere," Marcela replied, "even within the police." This revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Ramirez leaned forward, his eyes flashing with fury and determination. "We need names, Marcela, as many as you can remember." Marcela nodded and began listing names and connections. Each revelation was like a bombshell, unraveling years of carefully hidden corruption. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness for a few seconds before the emergency lights activated. "Everyone down!" Ramirez shouted, drawing his gun. The sound of breaking glass filled the air as a smoke grenade rolled across the floor, filling the room with thick, acrid smoke. Amidst the chaos, Marcela felt someone grab her arm. Terrified, she turned and met Roberto's determined eyes. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, pulling her toward the door as they moved through the smoke and screams. Out of the corner of her eye, Marcela saw a familiar figure moving in the shadows. Her heart stopped as she recognized Javier, his face filled with fury and determination. "Watch out!" Marcela shouted, pushing Roberto away just as a gunshot rang out in the room. The chaos intensified. Amid the smoke and confusion, Marcela lost sight of Javier. Ramirez and other officers shouted orders to control the situation as Roberto led her toward the exit. Marcela realized that the truth she had fought to reveal had now put her in the center of a deadly storm. The final battle was just beginning, and the outcome was far from certain. The chaos at police headquarters stretched on for what seemed like an eternity. Marcela and Roberto ran through the smoke-filled hallways, the sound of gunshots and screams echoing around them. Laura followed close behind, her face reflecting terror and determination. Turning a corner, they found themselves facing Javier, who held a gun in shaking hands and bloodshot eyes. "You!" Javier growled, pointing the gun at Marcela. "You've ruined everything." Roberto instinctively stepped between Javier and Marcela. "Put that down, Javier, it's over!" For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Javier looked at his sister, then at Marcela, then at Roberto. His hand was shaking visibly. "You don't understand," Javier said, his voice cracking. "I did it for family, for legacy." Marcela stepped forward, ignoring the danger. Roberto's whispered warnings hit Javier like a physical blow. "I did it for greed and power. You betrayed your own mother." The words seemed to resonate with Javier, making the madness in his eyes give way to painful clarity. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the tense silence. Detective Ramirez appeared at the end of the hallway, pointing her gun at Javier. "Drop the gun, Villarreal!" she screamed. Cornered, Javier looked frantically around and in a final act of desperation grabbed Marcela as a human shield, pressing the barrel of the gun against his side. Marcela's heart was pounding, but she remained surprisingly composed, looking directly into Javier's eyes and seeing not a monster, but a broken, desperate man. "Javier," she said softly, "think about your mother. Is this what she would want?" Her words seemed to penetrate Javier's last barrier of madness, causing his grip to loosen slightly. Roberto, seeing an opportunity, lunged forward and disarmed Javier in one swift motion. Ramirez and other officers immediately intervened, subduing Javier and handcuffing him. As he was led away, Javier looked at Marcela one last time and muttered, "I'm sorry," before being dragged away by the officers. Marcela collapsed into Roberto's arms, relief and exhaustion finally taking over. Laura joined the hug, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Ramirez approached the group, displaying a mix of admiration and concern. "They are safe now," she said, "but this is not over yet. The network they have unmasked is vast. We will need your help to dismantle it completely." Marcela nodded weakly. "We will do whatever it takes," she replied, her voice tired but determined. As they left the headquarters, dawn was beginning to tint the sky in pink and gold hues. Marcela looked out at the new day ahead, aware that although they had overcome this test, the path to justice and healing was only just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. Together, they could face whatever came. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of statements, meetings with lawyers, and visits to the hospital. The Villarreal mansion, once a symbol of opulence and power, now remained silent and empty, guarded by police officers. Marcela stood in Doña Teresa's room, watching as the old woman looked out the window with tired but clear eyes. The treatment to counteract the poisoning had been exhausting but effective. "Marcela, my dear," said Donna Teresa, turning to her. "How is Carlos?" "Improving day by day, madam," replied Marcela with a soft smile. "The doctors say he will be able to receive visitors soon." Donna Teresa nodded, a shadow of pain crossing her face. "And Javier, my poor Javier?" Marcela came closer, taking the old woman's hand in hers. "It wasn't his fault, Donna Teresa. Javier made his own decisions, and Laura, followed closely by Roberto, entered the room with signs of exhaustion, but also determination. "Mom," said Laura, approaching the bed, "we have news. The prosecution has agreed to a deal with Javier. He will testify against all those involved in the corruption network in exchange for a reduced sentence." Donna Teresa closed her eyes, silent tears sliding down her cheeks. "My family. How did we come to this?" Roberto cleared his throat and in a soft voice intervened. "Mrs. Teresa, all is not lost. Your and Marcela's courage has been crucial in dismantling years of corruption. You are helping to clean up not only your family, but the entire city." Marcela nodded, gently squeezing Mrs. Teresa's hand. "That's true, and you're not alone in this. We're all here to support you." Laura sat on the edge of the bed, taking her mother's other hand. "Mum, I know it's hard, but we have the chance to rebuild, to do things right this time." Mrs. Teresa looked at her daughter, then at Marcela and Roberto, and a spark of the strength that once characterized her shone in her eyes. "You're right. I can't change the past, but I can help forge a better future. I would appreciate it if you could share your impressions and opinions in the comments section. I would be very honored if you would leave me a like. I also invite you to see the following story, which is really impressive. Blessings.